Welcome to Global Money Talk, brought to you by Sampro TV. Greetings to all of our viewers from across the U.S., Korea, and around the world. We're coming to you live from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in New York City, the financial capital of America. I'm Remy Blaire, and joining me today is Tai Wong, independent proprietary trader. Well, happy Wednesday to you, Tai, and good morning.
Good morning. Great to be here. It's getting chilly out there.
It is.
We have the Christmas. I see we have the Christmas tree lighting. I think it's later today, this evening. They're building that up. It's nice. And today, December 4th, National Cookie Day. So, what's your favorite cookie?
You know, I'm not a big cookie person, surprisingly.
Oh.
I tend to prefer savory things like chips, for example, but I guess I would say perhaps oatmeal raisin, chocolate, walnut comes to mind. What is your favorite cookie, Tai?
So, as a child, I loved David's cookies. They're chocolate chunk cookie. And the sad thing is you can't really get that anymore. David's cookies is still around, but the formulation has changed, and it doesn't have the magic that it did. Like, I have this memory of this wonderful cookie. I don't know if I'll ever have it again. But I do like Wegmans. Wegmans chocolate chip is pretty good. Not the David's cookie of my youth, but still pretty good.
Well, do you like baking cookies?
No, I rather like eating them.
Well, perhaps this holiday season you can try to recreate that cookie and come up with your own recipe.
Yeah, that sounds like work.
It does. Well, as we head into today's session, we're seeing a green across the board today, and we're seeing the Dow, Nasdaq, and S&P 500 higher. So let's start out with a look at the major stock averages. So the Dow Industrials are below the 45,000 level today, but they are higher on the day with Salesforce up by 9% following their earnings report. So we're looking at the Dow still lower below the 45,000 level, but still higher on the session. Meanwhile, the Nasdaq is higher this morning, and the Nasdaq Composite Index extending gains and up by 1% on the session, nearly 200 points. And this does come after a record in the previous session, so extending that record today. Meanwhile, the S&P 500 is also in positive territory this morning, higher by 0.4% and well above the 6,000 level. So, Tai, we have a lot going on. United Healthcare is in the spotlight as well today. What do you make of what happened this morning in Midtown Manhattan?
I mean, a bit shocking. I saw the headline, and apparently the CEO of the insurance division, Brian Roberts, I think, I don't have the name right off the top of my head, but he showed up for their United Healthcare's Investor Day, and at 6:45 in the morning, someone shot him. From about 20 feet away, apparently a masked assailant who escaped. Brian Thompson is the name. Thank you for that. It's shocking. Crime in New York is not what is worse than what it was when we had the Giuliani Bloomberg administration, when it was really safe. But it does seem that specifically this may have been looks like a targeted attack because. 6:45. Who's out there at 6:45 in the morning? With a drive-by shooting. Maybe it'll come out that it's something that maybe United Healthcare didn't offer coverage for something that somebody felt that they should have. But too soon to say. But nevertheless, it is quite sad. And certainly thoughts with his family, with the firm. The firm I think is largely unchanged right now. But too soon to tell what was really behind it. But certainly very sudden for something to happen like that.
Yeah, and indeed, as the market opened, we were getting headlines and breaking news coming in this morning. So we'll keep an eye on that story today. And as you mentioned, in terms of share prices, at the open, shares of United Health were higher, but right now they're just up by 0.5%. And of course, condolences to the family as well as the firm itself. So as we head into today's session, we'll continue to monitor economic data. Of course, at the end of this week, we get that Friday jobs report, but we got ADP employment this morning coming in below expectations, and we got JOLTS figures yesterday, so a better indication of what's happening underneath the surface, especially when it comes to the labor market. Any surprises for you, Tai?
So JOLTS was a little bit better than expected, but didn't blow the doors off. Enough to change, I think, the market view. I think markets really didn't react to it very much. Certainly, it had ticked up from the previous month. Job quits were also a little bit higher, suggesting a little more confidence. but you're getting a fair number of stories that jobs are hard to find, that certain jobs, people for data scientists who are in huge demand, are actually struggling a little bit to find jobs. So I think the market is still the hiring market is still uncertain. They want to see what actually comes out after the inauguration. What does the Treasury Secretary do? What happens with tariffs? The financial markets certainly like it. You can look at the S&P. It's back to its habit of, oh, we'll be up 0.3%, 0.4% on a daily basis. Money coming into the market has to find a home, but business still feels a little uncertain. And this morning's ADP figure was a little bit disappointing. Around consensus, but the revisions to last month were substantially lower. Last month was a really good figure. I think it was maybe 225,000 ADP jobs. That got marked down to 185,000. So net a weaker report. The one thing that was sort of positive was mortgage rates fell, I think 17 basis points from last week, and that's the biggest 1 week drop since August. And that's in part due to the big rally in bonds that we saw after Scott Bessent was nominated to head the Treasury, which the market certainly liked. Are we going to get much more of that? It is unclear, certainly at this stage. The Fed, I think, is likely to cut. It's the odds are now being priced at 80-20. Excuse me, 80-20 in favor of a cut. And this is Christopher Waller, who's the governor of the Federal Reserve, had a really interesting speech yesterday. He said that the headline was that, I think we have room for, I'm leaning towards a cut rather than a pause. But I read the text of the speech, and it was really a wonderful speech, because even though that was the headline, he told us a lot of what he was thinking and what he was looking at. So, he said, I'm leaning towards a cut, but he also said, I look at PMI and ISM for business strength. Certainly a lot of the market looks at that, but it's nice to see that a Fed governor is also looking at that. And he said he cared about JOLTS and PCE, which is not a surprise. And then what else did he say? He said, cutting again will only mean we're not pressing the brake pedal as hard. So clearly he thinks we should cut, we have room to cut. Also, and then finally he goes, on the first day of the FOMC meeting, we received retail sales data for November. He's still looking at data on the first day of the FOMC meeting. So perhaps he's not decided. Now, he could be very, very clever and sort of hide the ball, but I don't think so. It seems that they're really going to be looking at it. And more important than the rate cut, which I think is really baked in, is what the dot plot is going to be like. What do they now see? What does the Fed see for the end of 2025? How many cuts are they pricing? And I think that'll be important. And then finally, a juicy bit, and I didn't know about Christopher Waller, is that he's an MMA fan. He spends a paragraph saying literally this: overall, I feel like an MMA fighter who keeps getting inflation in a chokehold, waiting for it to tap out, yet keeps slipping out of my grasp at the last minute. But let me assure you that submission is inevitable. Inflation isn't getting out of the octagon. So he uses all the right language. He clearly is an MMA fan. You know who else is an MMA fan?
Who?
President Trump. So could it be a dark horse to take Powell's job in the middle of 2026? He hasn't been mentioned, but Trump goes to a lot of MMA fights. He might still go to it when he's president. So just something to keep in the back of your mind.
Well, Tai, I think that's a very interesting insight, and those MMA references were very direct. So no doubt that we have better insight into what he prefers when it comes to how he assesses the U.S. economy, as well as when it comes to sports.
Yeah, it was a real gem. You didn't, the speeches aren't usually that interesting.
Yes.
Adriana Kugler, who is another Fed governor whose seat is actually up, whose term is actually up next year because she took over an expired term. She had a pretty lengthy speech. It was about sort of economics. She had a couple of interesting thoughts. She said that it's a mystery of why we've had the economy has done so well, but we haven't gotten inflation. And she points to two things. She's an academic, and she said productivity is running around 2% over the past couple of years versus 1.5% pre-pandemic. And that, plus what he thinks is substantially larger population due to immigration, which has helped add to the pool of available workers and add to productivity. So if you sort of extrapolate what she says, if there's a big crackdown on immigration, then perhaps she is more likely to say, well, we get fewer immigrants and a lower labor force, we may have to have more rate cuts. Now, I'm extrapolating a little bit there, but that's interesting in that she credits immigration in a larger working population for some of the very good economic performance that we've had over the past couple of years.
I think you highlighted a lot of moving parts there, because when it comes to Fed commentary, we're watching what officials have to say ahead of the December 17th to the 18th meeting. And as you mentioned earlier, we're getting the economic projections this time in the final Fed meeting of the year. And later on today, we'll be hearing from Powell as well. And we also get the Fed's Beige Book. So a lot to keep our eyes on as we head into the end of the week before Fed officials enter the media blackout period as well.
And we'll summarize it for our viewers, because not everybody's going to want to read Fed governor speeches. Folks have better things to do.
Yeah, even if there are MMA references,
yes,
right?
Even so.
Well, as we take a closer look at other things that we're watching today, let's take a look at oil, because we are focusing on what the Biden administration said yesterday in terms of sanctions. And this is the time of the week that we also get inventory figures as well. So let's take a look at where the oil markets are today. So as we move into today's session, we're looking at oil. Earlier in the session, we saw both Brent as well as crude oil prices lower on the session, and we are seeing both flat today. But ahead of the OPEC Plus decision, we had a lot of geopolitics in the spotlight as well. What's moving oil and energy today?
So what's interesting is it's an open secret that we have a lot of sanctions on Iran, but this administration in particular has left certain loopholes open in terms of you're sanctioning them, but they're allowing them to sell their oil and not clamping down too much because they're afraid that the price of oil is going up. And now that the election is out of the way, they're sanctioning ships that carry Iranian oil that they've known about. So that combined with OPEC saying, you know what, we're going to push back our additional production quotas another 3 months, helped oil rally about 2% yesterday. But the oil market is still sort of not very good, bumping along the bottom, both WTI and Brent. And it looks like there is more supply than demand. And unless demand picks up, or unless there's a big conflagration somewhere in the world that's unexpected, you'd expect that oil may continue to drift lower, may get into the may get that. Certainly wouldn't surprise me if we move below 60, at least for a brief period of time, where it feels like there are longs in the market who might be nervous and they need to get stopped out below 60. But in terms of externalities, and what happens in politics, one huge surprise that we had yesterday was I'm on a train coming in for the show, and I see martial law declared in Korea.
Yes.
And my first reaction was, oh my God, the North invaded. And it turns out that it was really a little bit of a disaster. It looks like the defense minister of South Korea recommended to the president, who has struggled with a hostile parliament. He can't get anything done. His popularity is down at 20%, where I guess they say the bar is the floor. You really can't get much lower than 20%, right? And he declared martial law to try to, I guess, move his things through Congress, and it completely backfired. Even his own party, the Conservative Party, said did not back him. Lot protests in the streets, and now it looks almost certain that they'll try an impeachment motion that is likely to succeed. With you need 2/3 of a parliamentary majority in Korea, and the opposing party is only 10 seats short of that, and his own party may not support him. What's important here is if he's impeached, and it may take the court months to convict him, he's removed from office, and he's no longer in office. He's no longer able to control policy. He has been very, very strongly anti-China, sort of anti-North Korea as well, but also one of the few Korean politicians in power that have come out favoring a reapproachment with Japan. And there's a lot of history with Japan before the Second World War. That relationship is certainly fraught, to say the least. And he was a pro-U.S., sort of pro-Japan, hard line against North Korea and China, and his successor may not be that. So sort of the ring of steel that the U.S. wants around China might be a little bit weaker if he's put out of power, which looks like he's likely to be. So a disaster for him, but not great for the Western alliance also.
Yeah, and I think what happened yesterday as the trading session was coming underway here in the U.S. is that whether we're talking about politics or geopolitics or even executive management with the United Healthcare Insurance Group CEO, you never know what's going to be moving the markets on a certain day. So I do want to talk about the concept of moving the Overton window. So explain to our viewers what this is and why it matters.
So it's an important concept. It started or invented by a guy named Joseph Overton. And he actually originally meant it to be what people believe policy ought to be. So as an example, in 1996, Bill Clinton, a Democratic president, passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which said marriage is only between a man and a woman. So that was generally very, very strongly supported by the American body politic at the time. Shift 20 years later, and the Obama administration, certainly a more liberal administration than Clinton's, declined to defend the Defense of Marriage Act, and gay marriage became legal. The reasoning behind that was the thinking of the American people changed. So the Overton window moved from not acceptable, gay marriage, to basically acceptable, and then it became policy, and then enshrined by the Supreme Court. So that's the dictionary definition. But the reason that it's important, and people use it, borrowed it for other reasons, is when politicians do something that seems at one point totally out of whack, but now suddenly is acceptable, is also moving the Overton window. So something that we saw very recently that is still a huge controversy here is President Biden pardoning his son. I think that moved the Overton window. He said time and time again, would never happen. Can't imagine it. No one is above the law. And suddenly, not only does he pardon the son for crimes committed, it's a blanket 11-year pardon for whatever he could possibly have done during that time. He's gotten a lot of flack for it. In some ways, a father for a son, protecting his son, perhaps protecting himself. But now this opens the floodgates for other actions sort of in the future. In some ways, Bill Clinton started it. He pardoned, on the last day of his term in 2000, he pardoned Mark Rich, who sold oil to Iran in defiance of an embargo. It was a big deal, and it seems very, very clearly that Mark Rich paid for that pardon in one way or another. So now, all of a sudden, Trump seems likely to pardon at least some of the January 6 protesters. There's going to be a yelling and screaming about that, but there's going to be less because misusing the pardon power, you might imagine, has become a little bit more acceptable. It's the same thing with South Korea. The declared martial law, and a huge surprise, and a fundamentally inappropriate move, but he put it on the map. Certainly the government and the people said, no, you can't do that. Hasn't been done in 40 years, but it was done, and it may have shifted a little bit. Similarly in France, I don't know if I think the vote's happening as we speak, but the government may fall because the national rally, Marine Le Pen's rightist party, wants to wants to break down the government. Now, what will really happen? Likely is they may have to go with a budget that they had last year going into next year, which is important because you can increase defense spending, which they were planning to do, and perhaps help Ukraine. But all these things, when politicians do things that were once considered, maybe unacceptable, but now becomes within the realm of possibility, moving that Overton window is important, and often generally not necessarily a good thing.
And I think when we're talking about this whole concept of the overtone window and why we see this shift, I think that's a sociological or philosophical question. But in a nutshell, why do you think these changes happen?
I think you have, over time, um, certainly with 25 years ago, we had basically 3 or 4 networks, right? Maybe ABC, CBS, NBC, and CNN. Um, and there was a sort of the information was a lot less, I would argue, democratized, um, and the range of opinion was something like this. I think the range of opinion today, given the distrust in what is called mainstream media, and so many sources of information, the range of opinions is like this. So you can sort of do something that was outlandish 20 years ago that's no longer outlandish now. Donald Trump would never have made it, I think, in 1996, as a serious candidate. But he became a more acceptable candidate because that range of sort of knowledge and acceptable actions got broader. Part of it was President Obama was faced with a hostile Congress. At the very beginning of his term, he wanted to get Obamacare through. He had 60 votes, but in the Senate, which prevented a filibuster. But then Edward Kennedy died, and he lost his 60th vote. But in a brilliant bit of maneuvering by the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, he said, "I'm going to get Obamacare through reconciliation." And so I basically pushed aside the filibuster. That also moved the Overton window. And then Obama decided, I have a hostile Congress, I'm going to use executive orders. That got people angry. And in some ways, that anger was reflected in Donald Trump. So as people pushed I think the politicians and people pushed the boundaries of what is acceptable wider and wider, that's why those Overton windows are shifting, I think, more rapidly than they had before. Do we get a backlash? Hard to say, but I think once the wider it gets, it's harder to close it up again.
And I'm sure the advent of social media and the ability for Americans and the general public to comment, especially under pseudonyms or anonymous accounts as well, that has something to do with some of the reaction as well as the dialogue that continues when it comes to these things.
You're exactly right. There used to be 4 networks, 3 or 4 networks. Now anybody can have a platform on X, right? Whether you like them or not. They basically let you say whatever you want to say within broader boundaries than was acceptable. And you could argue that with big tech, you need something like that. But something you're exactly right. It broadens the Overton window.
And we do want to move on to other topics, but we think about ownership of some of the social media platforms out there and how they've become so divisive, especially X, for example.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And you could say that it's interesting because there are the people who love Tesla, who drive Teslas, are probably a demographic who hate the fact that Musk owns X. But Tesla's really the dominant, at least in the United States, the dominant player in terms of electric vehicles. And ownership is important, and you can see that even with the heads of Google, the head of Facebook, they're all going to Mar-a-Lago to talk to President Trump. Let's not break up what we have. But ownership is important. Where news comes from is as important as the news itself, which is sort of sad because you can't expect. Maybe I shouldn't say that. It's hard for working people who are not paying the financial markets all the time, like us, to really understand the nuance of, Zero Hedge says this. Well, Zero Hedge has sort of their own bias, or the Washington Post says, and certainly they have their own biases. Or it's the Wall Street Journal news section versus the opinion section. They're actually often on different parts of the spectrum in terms of an issue. It's gotten harder in terms of trying to figure out what's accurate. You have to do a lot more work, and you couldn't sit back and listen to that. In the old days, Walter Cronkite or Dan Rather or somebody who was an authority, who was accepted as an authority because they built decades of reputation.
Yeah, and you mentioned Mar-a-Lago, so I do want to shift our focus on over to a name that has been making headlines yet once again, so Rick DeSantis,
Yes.
right? So I do imagine, as you mentioned, with all the visitors that Trump is getting in Mar-a-Lago, that it's been quite busy down there, but at the same time, why is DeSantis back in the headlines?
So the Defense Secretary nominee, Pete Hegseth, has had a number of issues come up, mostly with alleged behavior. And you feel a little bit bad because I'm sure his marriage is not, it isn't the better for it with all these things coming out. Now, is there a smoking gun? I don't think there's been a smoking gun. There doesn't seem to be. He might have done something sort of morally morally questionable. That may be between him and his wife, but ethically questionable, it is unclear. But his candidacy seems to be wobbly, and there are a lot of folks who think, he's a reservist, he's a soldier, has good ideas, but should he be running the world's biggest bureaucracy?
Yeah.
There's some doubts about that, and this just really inflames those doubts. So it came out yesterday that Ron DeSantis, maybe if he fails or has to withdraw, may be his replacement for defense secretary. I like to think the markets will like that. I don't think they'll rally the way that they rallied for Scott Bessent, but for someone who's run, one of the most populous states in the union, run it very, very well, really turned that state from sort of purplish to essentially deep red in his sort of 6 years at the helm. Is he a better guy to run the Defense Department? And he served as well. So the answer for most people is say probably yes. Then they'll have a special election. Now, on that note, we finally finished counting the election.
Yes.
California, 4 weeks later, finally finished counting, and the last seat went over to the Democrats. So the Republican majority is 220 to 215, which is pretty tight. But it's going to get a little tighter, especially in the very beginning, because Elise Stefanik in New York is going to be UN ambassador. Matt Gaetz, I think, who's counted into 220, will not be, as far as we know, taking a seat in the 119th Congress. So that 5-seat majority is now a 3-seat majority. It will probably become a 5-seat majority again because both of those, Gaetz and Stefanik, are in very, very safe Republican seats. In part of the reason why I think they were selected, because that's a pretty tight margin. It was unworkable for House speakers in the past. Kevin McCarthy was pushed out because of it, thanks in part to Matt Gaetz. But I think Trump will have a little more, certainly in the first 100 days of the administration or even the first year, that he's going to be able to bully the folks that do what he wants to do. It will be hard to stand up against a president who won the Electoral College and the first Republican in 20 years to do that. So I think he'll get it through, but it is relatively tight. There's not a lot of room for error.
Yeah, and if the first Trump administration is anything to go by, we haven't even entered 2025 yet, and Biden is still president of the United States. So it'll be interesting to see what transpires in the new year if these past couple of weeks have been anything to go by.
I think what is likely to happen is he's going to do things that he's promised and that's easy. And I think that's the border. He's already done it in terms of threatening Canada. If you don't stop the immigration or coming through fentanyl coming through your borders, we're going to levy more tariffs on you. And Trudeau has gone to visit Trump and says, most of the problem is the other border, not us. Can you take it easy? Trudeau is in a fight for his life in terms of an election sometime next year, and he's threatened Mexico. I think there have been quiet discussions about, Mexico, you stop the problem, or we're going to make it really, really painful for you in terms of exports. We are their biggest trading partner, I'm pretty sure. So, he's already flexing his muscles. I think tariffs will come, but tariffs might take sort of 3 to 6 months, depending on how it goes. But the first thing that's going to happen is probably immigration, which, let's see how the markets see that. Are they going to be worried about sort of fewer people and higher inflation? Too soon to tell. We'll have to see what happens. But I think that'll be his first move.
Well, this will definitely be something to watch, and we'll have a lot to discuss as well as we head into the new year.
Absolutely.
Well, Tai, as always, thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to speaking with you again next week.
Great to be here. Looking forward to that Christmas tree lighting tonight.
Yes, thank you, Tai. And that will do it for Global Money Talk, live from the New York Stock Exchange. We're so excited to bring you daily coverage here on Sempro TV. You can check out the show anytime on our YouTube channel by searching Global Money Talk. Thank you so much for joining us, and 3Pro will be back here tomorrow. Have a great day.